flight 125, Terry.
Carrying on flight 125.
Runway 125, keep it rolling around the corner. Runway 24, you're cleared for takeoff.
Runway 24, cleared for takeoff. Carrying on flight 125.
Carrying on flight 125, contact SoCal departure. Good day.
Over to SoCal, good day. Looking forward to hearing more of the SR-71 story.
3 more to go.
Woohoo!
Start it up.
Welcome to Podcasting on a Plane. I'm Brandon Gonzalez, and that was Anthony Aviator of early Podcasting on a Plane fame, and this is your aviation audio magazine. We hit aviation from as many angles as possible here, and my favorite 2 angles are, of course, from the cockpit and from the tower. And that's because I'm an air traffic tower controller at a busy GA airport, but I'm also a CFI and a pilot, and I specialize in high-performance transition training and mentoring pilots into the complex world of our national airspace system. Or to put it more simply, I'm the one you call if you're a GA pilot and you want to level up your game in the plane and, of course, on the radios. But hey, if you came here just to listen to a podcast today, well, that's fine too, because on this one, we share stories, news, and experiences that'll help you love aviation even more. And speaking of loving aviation, we're coming off of SR-71 Spy Week, and if you haven't listened, you have to. It's 5 episodes, 61 through 65, and the simple truth is that during Spyposium weekend at the Kalamazoo Air Zoo, the reality of what took place ended up being 100 times greater than any of us had hoped, and the guys there shared their incredible histories, and I'm just honored to have shared them with you. And real quick, if you have anything you'd like to pass on to the guys, as our stories of your own, a message you'd maybe like them to hear, even a question for them, send it on in, and I'll be glad to pass it along to the group, because they'd love to hear from you. And actually, here's a good example. I got this comment on Instagram. It's from Skyhawk328, and he says, I listened to it on the way home from giving a flight lesson today, and it brought a tear to my eye. Yep, after 53 plus years of flying, I'm still moved by people who made such an important contribution to our passion for aviation. You outdid yourself this time. This week's Podcasting on a Plane is going to change lives. You may never know which person listened and decided, you know what, this is what I want to do. But we who fly and teach are indebted to you for your work on the podcast. Dang. Well, thank you, Skyhawk328. And my role was, of course, to interview, record, and produce all that for you. But all the credit, of course, belongs to those incredible individuals who shared their stories so eloquently and who traveled there to do it. But what's really cool, this Skyhawk328, well, he has a real name, and it's Ron Horton. He's the CFI too, and a pilot examiner, and he's also now a patron of this show. So Ron, welcome, and thank you so much for the nice comments. And one more thing he said that I wanted to share with all of you because it makes a really cool point. He wrote me in a separate email that, quote, I've found that quality podcasts have expanded my aviation horizons far greater than I could ever have accomplished back in the good old days when knowledge transfer was limited to whoever hung around the airport and maybe a couple of aviation magazines. Well, Ron, that's something that all of us involved in aviation podcasting really want to hear, not just me, because it's one of the biggest reasons we do this. And to that end, you're all going to love today because knowledge transfer is high, and it's all about flying and air traffic. More on that in a minute. But first, remember episode 45? I'm kidding, of course you don't, but it was a really good one because in it, I talked with fellow Purdue alum Muharrem Mane, and he's the founder of Plain English, which is an app. It's available on iOS and Android, and it allows you to interact with an AI-based software to practice your ATC communications. If you want to check it out for yourself, I highly recommend it. There's a link in the show notes to go download it. And Muharrem, I'm proud to welcome you also as a new Patreon supporter of the show. And his timing's basically perfect because today's episode is 100% air traffic. And frankly, it's about peeling back the curtain a little more than usual. And that's because today we get really into it as pilots, a little more than we normally do. Did I say we? I did. And that's because today's content is in collaboration with the ATC How-To podcast of note, Opposing Bases. Except today, the part of AG will be played by yours truly. This whole conversation started from an email sent by one of both of our favorite patrons who goes by the operating initials Kilo Lima. And it goes something like this.
All right, everyone, I'm with Bravo Golf, our friend from Podcasting on a Plane. Today we're going to answer a question that was sent to both of our podcasts. Our listener, Kilo Lima, sent us a joint message, and she says, Gentlemen, last September 30th, I faced the real possibility of my own death. As the three of you and many of your listeners well know, a lot can happen in a year. I was still a student pilot then, but fast forward to this week, I've just taken my first steps on the path of instructing future aviators. So I could use your help on a topic I'm very passionate about. communicating with air traffic control, of course. Specifically, I've been wanting to prepare a lesson on what students can expect at a towered airport, but really think the matter could be best addressed by experts who produce informative and fun podcasts. I recognize that for some students, this experience starts on day one, the moment they receive taxi instructions to the runway. But for others, the overwhelming feeling comes with flying inbound to an unfamiliar airspace. Personally, my first towered airport experience was a busy Virginia regional with staggered parallel runways, and I really wished I had a pre-brief on what I could expect to hear as I approached and did a few laps in the pattern. She continues, I would love it if you could join forces and produce a collaborative East Coast, West Coast segment on the subject, because I feel strongly that there is absolutely no reason why a student pilot can't learn these things on the ground before they fly. The less time a student is holding down the push to think button, the better. I have some specific phraseology in mind to cover, but happy to share in separate correspondence to keep this short. Keep up the great work. Love, Kilo Lima. All right, we use that as a basis for our discussion today. We did have an exchange back and forth where she presented a few different ideas on what certain phraseology terms mean, and we're going to get to that. What's up, BG?
Hey, glad to be here. How are you doing, man?
I'm good. It's been a while since we did an episode together. How you doing?
Good. Congratulations on 100.
Thank you. And your show is continuing to get better and better each time. I just finished listening to Spy Week. If you haven't heard that, check it out. It's awesome. Great work with that.
Thank you.
What inspired that week?
Well, the SR-71's always been one of my all-time favorite aircraft. I mean, I think for pretty much anyone in aviation, it has to be. And, I got an email from a patron of my show who had the power to put something together like that. And so I ended up going to Michigan and sort of collaborated with the museum there, the Kalamazoo Air Zoo. And we put together we recorded everything that these guys said. But so these gentlemen travel the country and they do a spy posium, they call it, where it's RSOs, which is the backseater, the reconnaissance systems operators, the pilots, and the maintenance chiefs who worked on the SR-71. And as they travel the country, what they do is they just they meet with you, they hang out at the museum for an entire weekend, and it just becomes this giant hangout session with these history makers. And we were able to record almost 11 hours of interview content, and we kind of had to parse it down to a few episodes, but these guys just tell their incredible stories like it's nothing and like it was yesterday. And, it's everything that we never knew but kind of thought was happening with the Blackbirds. And, to have the honor of being with those individuals and recording with the museum, it was just the coolest weekend ever. And if you haven't heard it, check it out, because it's 5 episodes of just pure Blackbird.
It was awesome. I couldn't wait for the next one. I had to carve out time to finish them all up, and I think I did it in 2 days. So very well done.
That's impressive. It took me 2 months.
Oh, I'm sure it took you a lot longer to produce than it does to consume. Isn't that the case with podcasting, though?
That's right. But it's all worth it.
So I think you're a little more active in the instructing ranks right now. I don't know if any of your students are new or would be radio shy or scared, but the push to talk button, and that's a term she calls it the push to think button. And I think what she's referring to is the tendency for new students who are not as comfortable in a controlled environment to push the button and then start to think about what they want to say, when the reverse should have happened. Rehearse what you want to say, then push the button and just get it out. Keep it short and sweet. So let's run through some basics today. And, you tell me, are you running into this same problem now with students, or is the access to live ETC and various feeds out there helping students with that apprehension of pushing that button?
I think it's kind of the same thing that it's always been. I mean, throughout the history of aviation, or at least in places with a lot of air traffic, these are the same problems that sort of keep recurring. And some people are naturally a little more comfortable on the mic. And, I've flown with people that actually were in radio. I've flown with people that are performance musicians, and they really didn't get the mic fright as bad as some people do. But, the problem's always going to be there, that you don't think about it until you key up that button. The mic goes hot. You hear the side tone when you start talking. Oh my God, that's what I sound like. Oh, plus I'm broadcasting this to all these professionals on frequency that know what they're doing. And you get that fear, that sort of I won't say adrenaline shot, but instead of making you better, it makes you worse. The idea of talking on the radio is something that pilots have always struggled with. And I like that you mentioned that there's so many new ways you can learn. There are so many courses out there that are interactive. There are, matter of fact, I had one on my show recently that trains people to do that through their iPhone. But also live ATC is probably my favorite because you can sit there and just listen wherever you're at, in your car, at home, whatever, and just hear the language of ATC, because it really is a different language, but there's nothing magic to it. And, the more you listen, the more you just absorb it. Sort of like if I wanted to learn to speak French, it'd be the same thing. It's just a different language. And the more time you spend with it, the better you're going to get. I
agree. So before we get going into some of the more detailed and advanced items that a student may encounter or a new pilot may encounter, let's talk about some of the basics. Before you push that button, you can expect a certain amount of questions to be asked and answered during any routine flight. First, who are you? Where are you? Where are you trying to go? What type of plane are you flying? And how do you want to get there? Those are the type of questions that you're answering in a basic call-up. So we'll just take a basic Skyhawk. It's the easiest one to say over and over. Skyhawk 12345 at the signature FBO, request VFR flight following to XYZ airport, 3,500 feet. We have ATIS Mike. In that one little blurb, you answered all of the things that the controller needs to know. Now they know your call sign. Hopefully they started typing when you called them. We've talked about that awkward keyboard several times. We know where you are. We know what you want to do. And you said everything in the language of ATC. That seems simple. That one little bit can cause a student a lot of sweating and nervousness. Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of almost think of it as like when you're going to meet a new person, a new acquaintance, even like a business person or something like that. You'd say, hey, hi, so-and-so, I'm so-and-so. Here's why I'm here. Isn't that great? Oh, by the way, I brought this. And that little interaction is really the same thing, like you said. So who you're calling, who you are, where you are, what you want, what you have. So if you just say, hey, such and such tower, this is Skyhawk 123. Here's where I am. Here's what I want. Oh, and by the way, I have the ATIS. I mean, that's really all there is to it. But that's like 6 parts. And by the time you're about maybe part 2, part 3 of that, and you got that mic keyed up and you're hearing your own voice, sometimes that, like I say, that fear kicks in and you just forget the rest.
So a student can practice beforehand. You don't have to wait till you turn the engine on and start racking up, $10 a minute in the airplane. You can practice this at home. Practice it in the car. Practice making call-ups. No one's there to make fun of you. You can hear yourself in the comfort of your own car, your house. Practice it. That's the only way you're ever going to be able to push that button and not be nervous, is if you've said it 100 times beforehand. And like we mentioned already, you can hear this happening every day at the same airport. You don't have to have it on the computer. You could listen inside the FBO. I'm sure there's a way to hear ATC in there. Listen. Know what to expect. You want to start with what happens at a non-towered airport and kind of relationship to that?
Sure. So at a non-towered airport, we're not there to help you. So the FAA and the powers that be have determined that, a control tower is not really necessary at this airport based on the amount of traffic and the kind of aircraft that it is, things like that. So at a non-towered airport, I sort of liken it to an intersection without a stoplight, right? It's just stop signs. And there's a bunch of little rules that we all follow. The person on the right has the right of way, or whoever got there first, or whatever. And so it's that, but just more of them. So at a non-towered airport, your job is to just communicate as much as possible within reason, but you're not going to have a tower controller or somebody else watching the situation. So at a non-towered airport, you're going to have to broadcast pretty much all of your intentions. But the real fun part about that is you actually don't have to. And there are some people that choose not to for whatever reason. It's one thing if you don't have an electrical system, but it's entirely different if you just choose not to talk on the radio. So we have to be real vigilant because, again, there's not a bunch of controllers there to watch the situation for you. But if you're at a non-towered airport, you're not going to get any air traffic services probably on the ground unless the overlying TRACON has the ability to talk on that frequency. So you're just going to announce in similar the same way. So such and such traffic, I'm Skyhawk 123, I'm parked over at whatever, and I'm taxiing out. And of course, you're not going to have the ATIS because there isn't one, but that's about it. And then instead of asking to take off, you're just going to look and declare that you're taking off and things like that. Same thing when you're inbound. such and such traffic. Skyhawk 123 is 10 miles east. I'm going to set for left traffic to runway, 36 or whatever it is. I guess that wouldn't make sense, would it? 18. But still, you're doing it all yourself. It's sort of a DIY way to do it instead of going through a middleman.
Well, I think this is what leads to the apprehension at a towered airport. If someone learns, like I did, I got my private at a non-towered airport. I only went to a handful of towers during that training because of, there was no need to. You had to check a few boxes on control towers for your cross country and certainly during instruction with your CFI, but I didn't have to go to a towered airport. So when I went for the first time, it was a little bit scary because I had spent so much time not having to do all the formalities of talking to a controller. But don't let that make you feel like it has to be something to be afraid about. You can act normal, just like you would on the CTAP, broadcasting your intentions. Now you have someone that's actually going to respond.
Exactly. Yeah, it's really formality. I like that word. That's a good point because it's not. I think a lot of people think it's some sort of magic or we have some, I'm not even sure what the word is for it, but something that isn't really real that people kind of make up in their heads. I mean, really, working a tower is more of a blunt object than you'd think. I mean, we spend a lot of time talking and finessing things and making them work out. But when I crossed over into this side of things, I was actually really surprised at how much of it was just the skill of the controller and the tools that you have are adequate, but they're not really as special and amazing as I kind of had envisioned in my head. So once I realized that and, met the faces and so on, it wasn't really intimidating anymore. And frankly, I'm more intimidated by non-towered airports at this point.
Yeah, me too. Yep. Because you're thinking, man, there's no one to respond. I have to keep going with this script. Who's listening? Who's out there? And then you're trying to paint a picture with other people in the pattern without the benefit of a controller painting that picture for you. So I agree with you. After years and years away from that, going back into it not that often, it is a little bit scary for me.
We can get into this later, but now that most aircraft have some sort of traffic display on a multifunction display, when you go into a non-towered airport, especially if you're the CFI, you can almost play air traffic controller because you start seeing that bird's eye view that we have on a screen that, if you got a G3000, it's almost as big as the stars display I'm looking at and has more colors actually, and probably people's call signs that I don't even, if you've got, now that the ADSB thing's happening. So, you can play controller pretty easily and you're going to start seeing real quick, like, oh, there's a gap. That's where this guy's going to take off. I'm going to fit us in behind that third Cessna. I'm going to whatever. And really, that's kind of the main part of what you and I are doing all day long. And at a non-towered airport, you can figure it out and kind of do it yourself.
No, you're right. The amount of information available to the current general aviation pilot is really, really amazing. The tools you have available to you can be, if used properly, can really help you. If they're not understood and you think you know what you're talking about, but you really don't, it could get you in a little bit of trouble. But and I see that sometimes with pilots airborne maneuvering around one another, and it's because they aren't having the benefit of a controller helping them get through that scenario. But that's another subject, not here.
We can do another one about that.
Sure. So at a towered airport, now we're back in towered land. Most communication is going to start on clearance delivery or ground control. Typically, they're combined depending on how big the airport is. A big Bravo, they would not be. You would call clearance first. Now you're ready to taxi. You have your code. You got it from clearance. Skyhawk 345, ATIS Mike, ready to taxi to, and we'll just keep using the example from before, runway 18. All they're going to do is say your call sign and tell you how to get there. Anticipate that. Read back the instructions. Any hold shorts. Use your call sign, keep it short. Don't push the button and start thinking. That should have happened after you got your code. Draw yourself a little map. Use your finger to guide along the taxiway diagram or use your display to see how they're going to get me to this runway. Well, I think they're going to have me go like this. So when they do say your taxi instructions, it's not a big surprise.
Yeah, until you get to the very, very complicated airport layouts like, Chicago, Atlanta, LAX, things like that, there's usually only a couple ways you could get to a runway. Maybe only one. So chances are, again, you can play controller in advance and probably figure out how you're going to get there.
Right. Once you get there, you're going to switch over to tower, and then the rest is going to be fed to you. They're going to tell you exactly what they want you to do. Runway 18, fly this heading, clear for takeoff. Well, then the rest kicks in. You're training. You're flying an airplane. You have somebody you're talking to. They're going to tell you to contact a radar departure, most likely, or at an airport like yours, you may work them for a few miles and say goodbye. That's it. That wasn't that difficult.
Yeah, that's really all there is to it. I mean, departures are usually pretty simple because your intention is to just go elsewhere. So instead of having to be fed in where people are getting closer together, there's kind of naturally getting further apart. And then eventually, you're right, you're just going to leave our area of jurisdiction, and then that's, you're on your own, or you're off to the TRACON or wherever. We should probably mention that, where you work at Triad, you're dealing with a Class Charlie airspace. Mm-hmm. And where I'm at, it's a Delta, which actually, funny enough, is one of the busiest single runway airports in the country, and yet our Delta is pretty small. So we kind of get into a little bit of, I want to call it complexity, but our overlying TRACON is not downstairs or up in the cab with us. It's 10 miles away in another building.
Sure.
So for us, the way we handle that, we have to do a little bit of coordination because there's almost no way when I'm working jets into my airport that I'm only going to be talking to them within like a 4-mile Delta ring. There's no way.
Impossible.
So I'm working
Right.
airplanes easily as far out as you are at Triad, but it sounds different and looks different because it's not an up-down facility. So we have a lot of coordination going on with our overlying airspace at SoCal TRACON. And, our relationship is good and we have a lot of agreements of how we're going to do things, but we had to negotiate a lot of that stuff because it's not intra-facility, it's inter-facility. But we're going to both be working airplanes, especially us, in their airspace constantly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're in a very complex environment. It's certainly not conducive to not having some sort of agreement to get over that congestion. You have to be able to work in the other person's airspace without a lot of constraint, and that sounds like what your LOAs have accomplished.
Yeah, that LOA, by the way, is about 10 pages long, just for that part.
We've gotten into that a little bit on our show about the complexities of what the controllers between two different facilities have to know in order to work without having to get on the phone every 5 seconds. There's a lot of behind the scenes happening in this example on how you're leaving that airspace. So
Exactly.
Kilo Lima didn't really ask us to talk about anything en route. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. If you want to take a standard VFR flight following pilot, traffic calls is really what you're there for. They may restrict you. They may give you altitudes that help you stay away from certain airspace or other aircraft. If you can do it, do it. If you can't because of clouds or some other issue, then speak up. Tell them unable, offer an alternative, and work with air traffic. I don't think she's really looking for too much magical behind the scenes for en route. And I don't feel like as a controller that we run into that much difficulty with students that are already airborne that have gotten on the radio. They've already gotten over the big hurdle of starting that process, and we're just interacting with them. I'd say the big takeaway that I could offer is you may have been used to working in your non-towered airport and broadcasting on a CTAF, and now you're out in the wild with other airplanes. Just keep a listen for your call sign. Expect to get a call at some point. It's probably going to be a traffic. It may be something about your altitude. It may be saying goodbye because you're leaving their airspace. That would probably be the biggest hurdle we run into with pilots that aren't used to talking to controllers. They're not paying attention for their call sign, but that's pretty basic. I mean, en route, I don't expect a lot of problems.
Yeah, en route's pretty simple VFR. And plus, you and I are two terminal controllers, so to us, we're the fun happens differently with us. So
Right. So I think this is the part that we'll get into the weeds a little bit on planning ahead. So most of the instructions, and I hope you agree, BG, maybe they aren't, but most of the things that we say are predictable with a little bit of planning. So after you get your weather and you determine the landing runway of where you're going, put yourself on the map and try to imagine your relationship to that pattern. It may be a wider pattern, an entry point, but imagine your position in relation to the runway in use. Example, you're flying southbound towards an airport on north-south runways. If they're landing south, guess what? You can probably expect a straight-in approach. If that same airport were northerly flow and they're landing north, you can expect to enter some type of downwind. It may not be as close, a mile or a mile and a half away from the runway. It may be to accommodate departures like we do at Triad, but you can expect to get to the arrival side of the airport. You have anything to add to that part?
No, I mean, that's really, I think to get into the weeds a little more, again, since you're a Charlie, I'm a Delta with a separate TRACON, overlying, there's going to be a little bit of difference depending on what type of airport you're at. So for you guys, the approach controller is going to probably bring you in a little bit closer than the TRACON above us would. And then they're probably also going to set it up a little bit differently just because it's intra-facility. But for us, you don't have to have gone through an approach facility to get to me. You if you had flight following, great. But if you didn't, then you can just call me out of the blue as a 1200 code VFR airplane from literally wherever you're at, and then I'm going to give you pattern entry instructions. But the point is exactly correct, though, that you could probably figure out how it's going to be, because if you're, like, my runway is more or less an east-west thing, close enough. If you're 10 miles north, I'm going to tell you to enter right base. If you're straight to the west, I'm going to tell you to make right traffic, things like that. So even if the TRACON doesn't set it up in the same way that they would at Triad, the predictable instructions are still just as predictable as anywhere else.
Right. And if you're looking ahead, and it shouldn't be a surprise, you're arriving at the airport that you meant to go to, try to feed yourself a little bit of information so that those first instructions from air traffic aren't completely foreign. Like, they want me to do what? They want me to enter a down one. How am I supposed to do that? Well, if you rewind a little bit in that flight and try to anticipate, that first call should not come as a shock, and you'll feel a little more comfortable. Same with flying an instrument approach. If you're doing practice work, it's a different story. You may be trying to do some off runway, but the runway in use, if they're doing approaches, same idea. Where are you? What runway are they using? How are they going to get you eventually to final? And in Bravo Golf's case, you would be talking to the approach controller to do that. Presumably you have an ILS. That you guys ever have bad weather out there? You live in perfect land.
We get fog. I'm 3 miles from the Pacific Ocean, so we get a marine layer, but that's about it.
So you do have an ILS.
Oh, yeah.
And the overlying approach facility will conduct the approaches to that, correct?
Correct.
Right. So that controller is going to feed you to the tower in a certain fashion. You can anticipate how that's going to occur just with a little bit of planning and looking ahead. One thing I wanted to touch on, we should have mentioned this at the beginning. When you're leaving your towered airport, regardless of the fact that you're Delta versus a Charlie, typically you're going to get them in a place that they can exit the airspace safely. You're not going to always fling them on course, are you?
Well, I mean, it kind of depends. So every airspace in every airport in the NAS is going to have some hot spots, and we all are familiar with those on the airport diagrams of, where taxiway intersections could lead to a runway incursion, things like that. But, the same thing happens in the air, really. So at our airport, for instance, we have an issue with right downwind departures and then aircraft coming in down the shoreline from the northwest. They're going to be in conflict every time. So a controller at my airport is going to be really, really keen to watching that specific thing, or watching to prevent that specific thing from happening. And then same thing with the flow for the jet arrivals that come in on a right downwind from offshore, from off of Catalina, or for the straight ins. So there are some hot spots that we're always going to watch out for. So if you're departing, say, southbound along the shoreline, there's immediately what I think of is look for low-level banner tows, helicopters, and sightseeing flights. Give a quick look at that. If I don't see any, they can go as soon as they're clear of the Delta, probably even long before. But if they're going northbound, climbing to 5,000, I'm going to keep them a lot longer.
Right. Understood. Now, from a pilot perspective, all you had to do was, to anticipate. Planning is a lot of anticipating. What are the possible options that this controller can give me? Are they going to have me turn this way or that way? Well, I told them I want to go that way. All right, what pattern are we working on? Which runway are we departing? How am I going to get to this point in space? Those type of exercises and, pre-briefs with your instructor will really help you feel less baffled. I don't mean to talk down, but baffled. Nothing should really come as that big of a surprise, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I mean, the surprises in air traffic are usually not caused, at least I should hope are usually not caused by air traffic. So if the aircraft in front of you in the approach sequence lands and blows a tire and skids off the runway, okay, well, that's a big surprise and you're going to go around now. But that would be a surprise as opposed to something that a controller just out of nowhere blurts out like, hey, do this crazy thing I just came up with immediately. That should pretty much never happen. I mean, Sure, something could happen that wasn't noticed till the last second, but in general, the surprise shouldn't be what ATC is telling you to do. Because again, once you figure it out, it's pretty predictable.
Right. Well, here's the part that's not predictable. So typical student beats up the pattern hours and hours at a time. Downwind base final, power reductions, flaps, getting yourself set up for certain airspeeds. You do that over and over and over again. And you're doing it from pattern altitude, typically 1,000 feet above the ground. What happens when they go to an airport 20 or 30 miles away? You want to travel a little bit. You get some en route time. You get flight following. Now what? That's a big change for that pilot. If they were left to their own planning, they're going to struggle with, how do I figure out when do I start to descend? How am I going to arrive in this pattern altitude? And most importantly, how do I set up this airplane so that I can land it and I'm not way behind the power curve? I see this every single day with VFR pilots landing on our airport. We have to keep them high on the downwind. If they're coming from the arrival side, they're typically left above 5,000 feet so that we can accommodate our departing triad in that same direction. So when they get on the arrival side of the airport, now they're about 4,500 feet above the ground, and we tell them enter the base, contact tower, and I'd imagine there's smoke coming out of their brain. What do I do now? How am I supposed to get down? I don't get it. And that is okay. But I think a few little rules of thumb may help them get down. Before I get onto those with the complicated math, how difficult do you think it is for the average pilot to arrive at your field and plan ahead on that descent? Because you're not walking them down. You're not telling them to maintain an altitude. You just expect them to arrive at pattern altitude.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, a lot of that happens with the TRACON before they get to me. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times, they're very keen to this same thing we're talking about, because I think you're dead on. It's a problem that's sort of pervasive throughout the NAS, because descent planning is something that you don't really get any experience with. It's not taught very well, and we can talk about the reasons for that in a second, but it happens all the time that people on their solo cross countries will be very, very high. They'll be entering my delta 4 miles north, and they're still at 4,000 AGL. And obviously that's way, 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 way too high, especially for a right base entry. And maybe they were thinking they were going to get some pattern time to descend. I don't know. But I mean, frankly, our job is to expedite the flow of traffic as much as possible. So I'm going to give them straight into a right base or a straight in if the situation permits. But I'm usually watching them to see how high they are. And it's a big, big deal that they're usually way too far up there. Now, let's think about it. In their training, like you said, they spend so many hours beating up the pattern, and that's fine and good. But by the time you get to your solo cross countries, you're almost done. I mean, that's like the last phase before check ride prep. So, let's face it, how many times have you gone on a cross country at that point? 3, 4, maybe 5 tops. Mm-hmm. So you've never been able to practice this, whereas you might have 20, 30, 40 hours or more of all that other stuff. And your descent planning was always down from 3,500 feet, 4,500 feet in the practice area, and then come back. So you've been very honed to do that from your favorite spot. But you go to another airport, or you're coming into even your home airport from up high, I don't know. So yeah, it's a big issue. And I think a lot of CFIs, even, because if you think about that, it's hard for them to teach descent planning because they don't even do it very often. Mm-hmm. And they also aren't air traffic controllers, so they're trying to teach communications, but they're teaching something that they're not certified in. So I think, as a CFI myself and yourself and everyone, it's a tough job, because you're supposed to be teaching something that you either don't get to practice enough, or that you've never been or probably never will be certified to do also. So, I have a lot of respect for CFIs that really teach this stuff well, but at the same time, we got to realize that it's going to be tough for them to really teach your students to get it right. And then plus, on top of all the other things you have to be doing as you're approaching your destination airport, after all those minutes or hours of boredom, it's really hard to sort of mentally gear up for that. And that's just something that comes with, frankly, being around it for a long time, is that ability to ramp up with it. That's psychology. So, we're going to get into the rules on this in a minute, but planning a descent is actually really, really easy. It's just something that somehow kind of falls by the wayside.
Well, I think I had a rule with my students. I told them you need to know some basics about 4 times as well on the ground before we get into the airplane, because as soon as we shut the door, I personally believe they leave half of their brain inside the FBO. And as soon as they turn the key, we're down to 25% of brain power. So they need to practice and they need to understand some basics before we get into the plane really, really well, because when you're flying a plane, basic math is difficult.
Amen.
It's very difficult because you're not just thinking about math. You're trying to operate an airplane and get it configured. And even if it's the simplest of airplanes out there, you're still trying to get a lot accomplished. You have radios, you have speeds, you're aiming at certain points outside, you're trying to listen to air traffic. The last thing you want to do is at that point during the busiest part of your flight, start having to do math. But beforehand, you can kind of plan ahead. Use the map, use the distances from an airport, some landmarks. Hey, when I get to this point, I need to be at this altitude. When I get here, I need to be at this altitude. When I arrive on a 3-mile final, here's where the easiest part of the math comes in. And correct me if you think these are too general of numbers, but a 3-mile final, or 3 miles from the approach end of that runway, you should be aiming to arrive at your typical pattern altitude. Because let's think about it. When you're abeam the numbers at 1,000 feet above the ground, how many more miles left do you have to fly? Probably another mile on the downwind, a mile base, and a mile final. If you can duplicate that in the real world without the benefit of a pattern entry, you're going to be way ahead of the curve. You're not guessing on where to be. So I throw it out there for the VFR guy. You're attempting to arrive on about a 3-mile final 1,000 feet above the ground. Is that fair?
Yeah, that works for me. I had a really good instructor once that gave me a little bit of he called it an approach window for VFR. And, we have the same thing in IFR land with an approach gate. But he said pretty much when you're turning a mile final, you're going to want to be, what you said, about half that. So maybe a 1.5 mile final, you can be about 500 feet above the runway. And again, it's very rough. I mean, we can do the calculus out and get it way more precise than this if you're looking for a 3-degree glide path. And everybody flies their pattern a little bit differently. Some people like to stay, in and like sort of close and tight, and then it's a idle power descent to the runway. Some people like to pretend they're in a 747 and a 152, but very general terms, about a mile to a 1.5 mile final, it should be about 500 AGL. And like you said, if you extend that out, you can just keep on doing it. And really, we're just talking about the rule of threes, because once you move up into jets, sure, we have complicated VNAV descent paths and procedures that'll figure it out for you and things like that. But if it was really just a descent clearance to cross such and such that's 50 miles ahead at or above such and such altitude, you're going to have to do some quick mental math, or else you're going to be heads down in the box trying to make the computer do it the hard way. And so that's when we get into the rule of threes, and it works all the way down to the ground. You want to talk about that one?
Sure. So a basic 3-degree glide slope, which is what your pappy's been telling you to do in the pattern. I'm generalizing a little bit, but it's about 3 degrees. The rule of thumb is, we say the 3-to-1 rule. At 3 miles, you should be 1,000 feet-ish above the ground. At 6 miles, we would be 2,000 feet above the ground. At 9 miles, 3,000. You can see all we're taking is the distance, dividing it by 3, and that should give you a very close number to where you need to be in terms of your vertical descent profile. Did I oversimplify that?
No, that's it. And if you want to say it backwards, it's however many thousand feet you have to descend times 3 is how many miles back you got to start.
Right. And in the jet, now this is, worst case scenario in a jet where center forgets to descend you, or you get trapped above some other traffic into another airport. 30-mile ring around that airport, 10,000 feet above the ground, is an alarm for the pilot. If they get inside that 30 miles above 10,000 feet, they're going to have to descend at a higher rate than they normally would. So it's, again, 30 miles, give or take, 10,000 feet of altitude to lose. We're using basic numbers that go all the way into jet world.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. Because the thing is that, the shapes and patterns that we're making are really the same for the most part, regardless of the type of aircraft that we're working. Now, sure, you're probably not going to have a whole lot of 172s up at, up in the flight levels. I get that. But really, the rules are the same no matter how fast you're going or how far out you are, because the glide paths are fixed in space. So if you're flying a 747 or a Cessna 152 down the same PAPI slope, you're flying at the same more or less 3 degrees. You're just doing it at a different speed, so your vertical speed's going to be different. And, in the 152, you can slow down and go down a lot more easily than jet can. But that's really the only difference is how you're going to operate the specific equipment. But the patterns are very, very similar.
So this is the part that Kilo Lima really wanted us to talk about, and this is where we can, we've set our target altitudes. We know we want to arrive at about 6 miles away from the airport at about 2,000 feet, 3 miles from the field or from a touchdown point at about 1,000 feet. And guess what? We're in the same spot you would have been if you were beam the numbers. So at 3 miles, 1,000 feet above the ground, that's when you can start configuring your airplane. What do you normally do on downwind? You reduce the power to, I'm going to generalize, I'm going to go back into my Skyhawk days, 16 to 1,700 RPMs. You're shooting for, let's just say 90 knots for argument's sake. A mile later, you're turning base, shooting for about 80 knots. Same power, another notch of flaps. When you turn final, are you going to make it? Yes. Last notch of flaps, we're shooting for 65. Am I remembering a Skyhawk pretty well?
Yeah, close enough.
So aim for those same targets or marks when you reach that point in the flight where you would normally configure on the pattern.
Yeah, you're just taking the same path that would normally have a couple 90-degree turns in it and just unbending it to being straight out. But it's
Right.
the same stuff. The distances are the same because, the term that you're going to hear a lot of controllers use, like RH and I, is miles to fly.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's really what it comes down to. Because no matter what direction you're flying and no matter what type of aircraft you're flying and no matter how fast you're flying it and no matter what the weather is, the amount of miles you have to fly is really what it comes down to, because that's how much distance on a path you have to make something work.
I.e. get configured, which means getting your speed right, getting your gear down, getting your flaps in. So, you're not having to struggle with this math. When you're planning your flight, look out and say, you know what? I feel like we've gone to this airport before. We're gonna be coming from the north. If we're going to Bravo Gulf's airport, they're gonna put us on a base. All right. When I'm 2 miles from intercepting the final or the final turn, I need to be starting to perform and make this airplane like it would be if I were on the downwind. I need to arrive there and start setting up. Don't do it 15 miles away. You don't have to be flaps 20, 15 miles away doing 80 knots. No.
As a matter of fact, please don't do that.
I'm sure you see it, because if they don't know when, well, I'll do it now. Well, great, but now you're really clogging up the works. You could have, used that extra 20 or 30 knots that your Skyhawk can do. It makes a difference for the controllers too, in terms of planning. But for you as the pilot, you don't have to feel like, I don't know when to do this, I'm just going to get it done now, because that kind of handicaps you a little bit, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, when you get into turboprops and jets, we start talking about profiles. And there's a profile for a straight in on a precision approach. There's a profile for a non-precision. There's a profile for a circling approach or a VFR visual, either a visual approach or VFR pattern. And the reason is because the more complex the aircraft and the faster it is, you're going to have to set things up a certain way so that they work out at the end, so that you end up configured at your ref speed or just a little bit above it as you're on short final, because it's all about energy management. So in a 152 or 172 that we keep talking about, energy management's a thing, but again, a 172 is a pretty blunt object, so you can slow down and go down at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Turboprop also, you can slow down and go down at the same time, which is kind of fun. But a jet, not so much. So I was a Dash 8 person, you were a CRJ person, so we're operating in two different realms of what we can do performance-wise. And, whether it's a 172 or not, you've got to kind of know what your profile is. And I know some flight schools have kind of gone so far as to set those up for, 172s for a straight in. And even for the VFR pilot who's not even considering an instrument rating, their CFI could actually show that to them and say, hey, look, if you're going to make a 10-mile straight in or a 6-8 mile straight in, whatever your ILS is going to be, this is what that's going to look like. So when you're on about a 7-mile final, you should expect to be about X many feet in the air. You should probably be setting up so that you can use your first notch of flaps, which if you're in a newer 172 is nice because it's 110. But getting near that flap speed so you can set that up and start a nice descent. And then as you're slowly descending towards the runway, you can add that second notch of flaps and you get down to about 85. And then the final notch when you got the runway made or thereabouts. And so it sets it up real nicely. And that way they can think, oh, if I don't have a pattern to reference, I can make some other reference points and be thinking about that very early in their training, as opposed to, oh my gosh, wait a minute, you want me to make a straight in? I've never done that before. And your brain's about to explode. And it's wait, you gave me the easy one? Wait, what does 2 + 2 equal again?
Exactly. See, they're not going to have time or mental capacity to do that math, and
Right.
They're going to be in scramble mode. And you're right, though. an instructor can very easily duplicate these real life scenarios at that same non-towered airport that they're beating up in a pattern. There's plenty of times where you're the only one there. Do it. Go out and join a 5-mile final. Show them what it looks like. Can they see the PAPI? Can they start to use that for vertical descent planning? Can they kind of take those distances out and say, all right, I'm about 4 or 5 miles away. This is the altitude I want to be at. Can they start to do that? Let them practice it and let them see what it looks like out the window, the important part of VFR flying, so that they understand when you're high and you have more experience in an airplane, as you approach an airport, there's no math involved. You can just tell, I'm on the moon. I need time to get down. And in time, you mean I need more distance to fly to get this airplane to the appropriate altitude. And as an approach control, we do that all the time. We watch descents all the time, depending on where we got them and how far away they are from the runway. We can tell when an airplane there's no way they're going to be able to get down. So we have to provide them with a vector to give them more miles to do it. You can practice that on the VFR side all day long.
Yeah, just give them more miles to fly. That's all it takes.
All right, so she brought up 5 clearances that may come as a surprise, and you may not hear until you're off into the wild by yourself. Let's hit some of those. How often do you say make a left 360 for an aircraft on the downwind?
Well, it's funny you should ask, because that's kind of one of my pet peeves. Actually, I try to that to me is that's my personal last resort.
Okay, good.
But that's just my opinion. There are times where a 360 is really where it's a last resort time, and that's the only option for any number of reasons, and we can't get into all of them here. But yeah, I try to avoid telling pilots to make a left 360 just because, number one, we all know that maneuvering at low altitude is to be avoided whenever possible, and we all know that sometimes it is really difficult for a pilot to do that, or a low-hour pilot, because they'll make that turn. And sometimes I'll make a real tight one, like, make a left 360, okay, I'll do it. But they don't really realize that this is a time waste. Like, I'm buying myself more time or some distance or something. And so they'll make a tight turn, and then I feel bad that somebody thought they should make a tight turn on my downwind, because that's obviously not safe. And then other times, just the idea of telling someone to make a left turn, they start loading up the airplane, getting a little bit slow. It happens very, very slowly. And it kind of just upsets the apple cart to me. So sometimes it has to happen. One of the times I will use it is on final. If there's someone behind them is rapidly overtaking them and there's really nothing they can do about it because it's a much faster aircraft, I may have them go around and, when safely able, make a left or right 360 to just follow the traffic that's behind them, overtaking them. But again, I'll be very, very careful to say, go around, climb straight ahead, and then when safely able, do it, because the last thing I would ever tell a flaps down, dirty configured aircraft to do would be make a right 360 back to somebody behind them on a final. Obviously, we don't need to go into why that would be insane. But there are times where sometimes it'll happen, but it's pretty much always going to be a surprise to a pilot, because just making a turn back around to where I came from, why would you want me to do that, right?
Right. Well, both examples, though, on the downwind or on final, you're trying to buy time. So the takeaway I think the pilot should know is that it's never going to be an urgent steep turn. We're trying to buy time, not put you through this maneuver for argument's sake, and see how fast you can do it. So take your time.
Adding miles to fly, which equals time.
Yes, exactly. So don't put yourself into a steep turn on downwind or on final, that you're missing the whole point of it. And I'll agree with you. That 360 on the downwind, for us, even with limited amount of downwind space, is still a last resort. Yeah. It's a better choice in our airspace to utilize distance on the upwind, because I own a little more space out there as the tower controller than compared to the airspace that we can go into on final as a tower controller. So the upwind is a great space for us to build that extra time. Extend your upwind, I'll call your crosswind. In other words, you're going to have to follow somebody. I need to build some space in now, and this is how I'm going to do it to avoid that 360 on the downwind.
Yeah, so. Absolutely. And if you catch it fast enough, that's usually the perfect option. But unfortunately, sometimes if it's the last resort, the time for that has already passed. But yeah, that's the extending the departure leg is probably the best way to increase space in the pattern. And we're lucky at my airport because there are several very distinct landmarks. There's a theme park that's about 1.5 miles off the departure end. There's a big freeway that's about 1 mile inland from the shore, and then there's the shoreline itself. And all of that's still actually contained within my airspace. but the shoreline's about 3 miles off the departure end. So I can extend somebody straight out to the shore, have them make right or left traffic at that point, and that just bought me 6 extra miles.
Right. Yep. And it's the miles you need so that they follow somebody on final in that case.
Yeah, exactly. And that many miles of Cessna time that's a lot of time.
So we kind of beat this one up a little bit. She mentioned make straight in runway 36, clear to land. You're 10 miles out. That could come as a giant surprise. They wanted some maneuvering. They wanted to hear a base. They were hoping for a downwind, and they didn't get it. And now they have to determine how they're going to get down. So I don't think we need to spend too much more time on that, but it goes back to your planning and your marks or your set goals. I want to be at this altitude when I'm this far away from the airport. And when you're VFR, you have the luxury of being able to do that outside of an air traffic instruction that told you couldn't descend. And that could happen, but we're typically not setting you up for a nosedive at your destination. We should be allowing you enough time laterally to descend your airplane.
Agreed.
Say intentions. I had to really think about this one. The first time I got this as a pilot, I probably was just as confused as most pilots are. And it really boils down to a fancy way for a controller to tell you, hey, all right, now what do you want to do? It could have been for a sequence that didn't work. It could have been for a go-around. It could be, all right, you did your full stop, you taxi back, say intentions. So now where do you want to go? If it's the first time a student ever heard those words, it's very blunt. It's rude. It sounds terrible.
Yeah, that's what when I first read this, I was kind of like, why? What's wrong with that? And then I realized, oh yeah, it sounds harsh, doesn't it? Say intentions.
It sounds like you did something wrong.
And a lot of times it is used in that context too, right before you get a phone number.
Yes. It's not always meant to be a response to something that went wrong. It's genuinely used in our airspace a lot of the time. So we have some schools that come and they'll do touch and goes, and 3 controllers later, the message didn't get past that they want to go depart again. All right, say intentions. Well, that's what's in our book, but all I'm saying is, now what do you want to do?
Yeah, that example you just used right there about when somebody lands and they want to taxi back and just depart again, that's really probably at my airport too, one of the most common times that's used, because they'll be landing on the runway, rolling out. I say, well, say intentions. And to some people, like, well, I'm based here. I just want to go park my plane. And okay, I know most of the based airplanes, but that's right. Turn left at Alpha for contact ground point 8. But if it's a call sign you don't recognize, or one of the ones that comes through a lot on the weekends just as a stopover, say intentions. What do you mean say intentions? I'm like later today or what?
Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, and I think really in that case, all we want to is, you want to go to parking or do you want to taxi back? Because I don't know about you at Triad, but at my airport, we're going to taxi you back differently. I'm going to have you turn right off the runway, and I'm going to taxi back myself on my frequency if you're just going to leave again. And if you're going to park, I'm going to turn you left, because all of the FBOs and transient parking are on the left side. So really, it's this huge open-ended question that's straight out of the book, which is why we use it. But yeah, it can be it's harsh and open and sort of, I don't know, I could see why that would be confusing now that I thought about it.
So the veterans or the GA experts, the ones who are flying a little bit more, they're going to use plain English. There's no script. Don't feel like you have to follow the exact book language of what to say next. Tell them what you want to do. Talk just like BG and I are talking now. Hey, we want to taxi back. We want to go back to XYZ. All right. Turn left. Taxi via mic. Hold short. Advise ready. That's not too difficult. But if it feels like it's a blunt response to a mistake or something that didn't go quite as well as it should have, and maybe the pilot is sharing most of that blame, you tell them you want to regroup. I want to try it again. We want to divert. We want to try this approach. Just tell them what you want to do. It's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. If you're like, hey, we want to taxi into the run-up area, swap seats, take off again in about 10 minutes. Okay, and say that. That's fine. Whatever you want.
All right, next one she said she hadn't heard until later on in her flying career. Make a 180, turn left on taxiway Bravo, taxi to the ramp. At our airport, we use that a lot. If you miss a certain taxiway and you want to go to point B, going to the next taxiway is going to take forever. So we'll just back taxi you on the runway. I said it. I did it the wrong way. It's not really a back taxi. She asked, why don't we say back taxi? We reserve back taxi at our field for an intersection entry onto the runway where they will have to go against the flow and turn around at the end of the runway and depart. We would not use the term back taxi. I wouldn't, at least, when I want an airplane to turn around on the runway and taxi to a certain spot. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, that one's kind of I don't think I'd use it if they just missed a taxiway and hadn't made it to the next one. I don't think I'd use back taxi either. I don't think that would be appropriate. I agree. So, right, if it was going to be anything other than a full-length takeoff, but starting from a not full-length intersection, then, because there's, of course, as you know, a whole fun set of phraseology for that one, too, if it's going to be an intersection takeoff. But, yeah, if they're going to, enter the runway at, say, Alpha 2, and then back taxi to the full length and then take off at the full length, making a 180, then that's obviously a different situation. So yeah, make a 180 on the runway could be used for a number of different reasons. Oftentimes we have one major taxiway, and like I said, 4 FBOs on the south side of the runway. So we have a lot of tows moving aircraft from ramp to ramp. So a lot of times something will be blocked in a way where we could just say, hey, make a 180 on the runway and then exit it such and such, because they're going to have to go stop and block the taxiway, and ground's just going to become a snarled up nightmare if we do that. So we can just turn them around on the runway, exit somewhere behind where that tow mess is happening, and then that's it. But I think I would agree I'd avoid the use of back taxi in that case, but it would be make a 180, exit at such and such, contact ground.
It's just a fancy way for us to say turn around. That's all.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to skip E for now. I'm going to go to a couple more of the quickies down there at the bottom. We'll go back to E if you don't mind.
Okay.
So we talked about this with VFR pilots being left high. We'll get into the math a little bit when we talk about visual approaches from an instrument perspective. Let's talk about a go-around. Even in the most basic airplanes with fixed gear, a fixed prop, and only a few different buttons, a go-around can be a little bit chaotic. Would you say?
Absolutely.
That may come for the first time outside of training, and you know it's coming because your instructor probably told you, hey, we're going to practice a go-around on this next one. Go-around. Well, go-arounds are not that hard when you know they're coming. When a controller tells you to go around and you really thought you were going to land, there could be brain matter all over the airplane. You have to pitch up, power up, clean up the airplane, run a checklist, level off at the assigned altitude, and then you have to figure out how you're going to get back into the pattern to land again. It's a lot going on. It seems from a control perspective, at least for the ones that are not pilots, I don't think they appreciate how difficult that maneuver is, especially by yourself when no one's there to help you. Anticipate it. That's my tip. Anticipate it. You're always going to be told to go around. And when you don't, great. But when it happens, it shouldn't come as a surprise. Is that a good tip for the average GA guy?
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that. And then to add a little bit more onto it too, say you go around because you wanted to, because you weren't configured properly, you're too fast, you're too high, you're not going to make the touchdown point on your power off 180. I don't care. I can't tell a lot of the times why that is. So if you choose to go around, great. I wish we had Captain Jeff's You Can Always Go Around song to play right now, but you can always go around. There's never a time, rule number 1 of air traffic, never set it up so a go around isn't a possibility, right? I know we say it all the time, but we'll say it again. You can always, 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 always go around. You can always choose to, and if you don't like it, then you 100% should. So that being said, one of the things that I see all the time is people feel like they have to tell us immediately, tell her I'm going around. You don't have to tell us you're going around immediately. I can see you. You're right in my airport. You're like 1,000 feet in front of me. I see you. I hear you. I'm watching you go around. Hey, he's going around. I'm just going to clear the next person for takeoff pretty much immediately behind that because they're never going to catch you now. Right. So if you're going around, aviate, navigate, communicate. Fly that plane first because just like you said, it can be chaotic, especially if it was a surprise because, again, we don't know why you went around. And we'll get to that later. I know you're going to tell me. I trust you. But for now, fly your plane first and then get it going straight ahead, cleaned up, good to go. And then you can just tell me, hey, I went around. I want to continue in the pattern. I'm just going to depart. Whatever. I'm having an issue. We got an emergency, whatever it is. Just tell me. But you don't have to tell me during the course of your immediate go around that you went around because we can see it.
Yep. I agree 100%. And a lot of the things that you feel like you have to tell air traffic really aren't that important right this second. A minute could buy you all the time you need to set up the airplane and then communicate. We can wait. We're patient. If we really need to know, we'll ask.
Yeah, I mean, if I saw you go around and you just quit talking to me, I may be moving towards emergency territory at some point, but I'm going to work everything around you at that point until I find out what you're doing. So you going around is not, or you telling me that you're going around is just, that is not your priority. So just fly that plane first. That's all that matters.
All right, we're going to talk about the infamous cleared for the visual approach. Do you remember the first time you got one in instrument training, or was it after you got out of instrument training that you got that approach clearance?
I think I did one during my training. We're just doing some fun cross-country time building, but yeah, it's actually I can tell you where it was. It was into Pewaukee Airport in Chicago.
Okay.
Straight into 1-6. I got cleared the visual from. I was still actually out over Lake Michigan when they did it. But
did it come as a surprise?
It was a little bit of a surprise because of how far out I was. You know, I was expecting a visual because Chicago Approach had told me that, and the weather was great, and I had asked for it. But at the same time, I didn't expect the clearance to come when I was still 5 miles offshore in Lake Michigan. So, so I suddenly had some planning to do. And that was what we talked about a minute ago, where the brain scramble starts, and now you got to figure out how you're going to get down to that runway.
Right. And I remember my first one I'm sure I got one in flight training, but at lower altitudes, it doesn't feel as urgent and as confusing. But I made the mistake of calling an airport in sight 30 miles out at about 12,000 feet above the ground. And I was with a company check airman. It was IOE when I was at the airlines. And they kind of laughed, and they called the airport in sight. Sure as anything, we got cleared for the visual approach, contact tower. And here we are, 11 or 12,000 feet above the ground. I could see the runway, but it's about 30 miles away. Now what do I do? How do I get this plane down? I've been instrument training in this plane in the sim. We literally get walked down every altitude. We get turned on to final. We intercept the glide slope, and we descend on a glide path using some sort of data in the plane. There's no way I can do that. What did I just do? I was baffled. And it didn't take but 3 or 4 miles before the captain said, "You are very behind." And I was. All I needed was one little kick from him. Let's get the airplane slowed down. That's the trick with the RJ. You had to slow it down so you can get it dirty, and then you could punch the nose down and start to descend without ripping the wings off. I should have taken advantage of the controller and let them get me down closer, perhaps on an intercept to final at an altitude where I can intercept the glide slope from underneath. But hey, I thought I knew what I was doing. I didn't. I needed a little bit of help, a little bit of guidance on my goals, but it all boiled down to figuring out the descent rate and trying to do some basic math so that, every 3 miles I was 1,000 feet lower as I approached that runway to, again, back to what we talked about before, to arrive on a 3-mile final on glide slope at about 900 to 1,000 feet. Take that out every 3 miles was another 1,000-foot goal, And it was impossible for me to do that math because I couldn't figure out how fast we're going along the ground. I was really just grasping at straws and trying to keep my head above water. But as an instrument pilot in training, you are given everything spoon-fed during an instrument approach. A visual approach is you're on your own, man. Figure it out. And if you make the mistake of calling the airport too far out, don't be surprised when they clear for the visual approach and you have to figure out what to do next.
It's kind of funny in everyday conversation, even sometimes we say things that imply that we want something like, oh, hey, look at the time, or these little subconscious or maybe overtly conscious things, but it works both ways. Like so the CRJ comes in, he's 30 miles out. Oh, hey, I got the airport. What's radar controller thinking? Oh, you must want the visual. Okay, great. Here you go. And then vice versa. Radar controller is telling you, so Triad Airport's 2 o'clock and 5 miles. Do you have it in sight? Well, they're now looking to give you the visual approach, right?
Right.
So there are these little implications that kind of come with how the way you say that. And oftentimes when a pilot wants a visual far out, hey, we got the airport in sight when it helps or whatever. So they may keep on stepping you down and then hand you off, but you're implying to the controller, I would like the visual approach as early as you can give it to me and I'm ready. And vice versa. When the controller is saying it, it's, I would like to give you the visual approach and switch you to the tower as soon as you can possibly do it. So those little implications are there sometimes. So when you key up your mic and say something like that, you just realize that sometimes that's what's going to be received on the other end.
Yep, I agree with you 100%. So if you start chomping at the bit early as the pilot, the controller's going to clear you. That's going to happen. Fine. Unless there's something in the way, like you're on the wrong side of the airport. That happens sometimes. But then I'll wait till you're abeam and clear you and ship you to the tower all day, every day. So unless you're ready for it, don't say you have the airport in sight.
Yeah, when you're talking to us controllers, I mean, realize you're talking to somebody who's spring-loaded to move you on to the next person as fast as possible.
Exactly. That's a great way to end that little topic there. Yes, we are ready to say goodbye. It was fun. It ended up being a good learning lesson for me. Take advantage of what the approach controller's job is to get you down, and don't be so anxious to call the runway unless you're fully prepared, which I was not. And I had very little experience visually flying that plane. I was on my 5th flight in that plane. And, of course, I picked the worst time possible to, be anxious and ready. And I have the field. Whoa, rookie. That was a mistake. But I learned from it.
Yeah, easy, Tiger.
Yeah, easy is right. So as a trainer, and Kilo Lima will eventually be an instructor, be aware of that. Try to teach it. Try to show them what it looks like out the window when they're doing a standard approach in ILS from really far out, so they can start setting up those mental pictures for a visual approach the day they get it.
Yep.
You want to close this one out with a little bit of a summary?
Sure. I was going to tell a story actually that, not a story, but I get asked questions all the time when I talk to local pilot groups, and I do a lot of pilot outreach in my area. And one of the questions I get, probably my all-time question is, and you probably get this one too, do you guys prefer it when we say, tower, call sign, shut up, or tower, call sign, and then belt out the whole thing? And at the very beginning of this conversation, we talked about that, and we sort of alluded to the belt out the whole thing, right? Because you're talking to somebody, again, who's spring-loaded to hear that and good to go. But this question, I like it because it seems so simple, like there's an answer. It's this or that, right? Which is sort of dualistic thinking. But what it also does is it illustrates the dichotomous way that this whole thing works, because it could be both things, right? It's just what is appropriate. Well, I would say, and what I do say to these individuals who ask me the question is, it depends on the situation. If you're going to ask me for something standard and normal that I'm expecting, belt it out, right? But if it's something that, hey, I want to do a photo mission circling over this place at this and this time and go over here, whatever, then maybe get me primed and we'll work on it later, right?
Right.
So sort of to close the whole point here, it's everybody, a lot of people kind of like want the answer, but what we've illustrated through this whole conversation is that when you get out in the real world outside of training, you can do all these training scenarios and then you get to the battlefield and it's war, right? Mm-hmm. So you're trying to remember all these scenarios and trying to recall this memory from a year ago when you're in startle factor mode. And we all know that's impossible. I mean, any psychologist can tell you that's just not going to work, right? So we need to be thinking and primed and ready. And the best way to do that is to just anticipate what's coming next and play controller yourself, right? So if you have, an iPad with a Stratus or, a Garmin set up like a 1000 or 3000 with traffic on it, you can really figure out a lot of this stuff. And if you're not getting your descent when you're ready for your descent, if you're VFR, I'm ready to start my descent now. The controller will let you down as long as there's no one beneath you. And if there is, then, oh, hey, thanks for not letting me descend into the traffic beneath me, right? Mm-hmm. So a lot of this stuff is not magic. The tower is actually more of a blunt object than you'd think. And the moral is that you just kind of always need to be thinking and doing what's appropriate for the situation. And the best way that you can do that is to just think ahead as far as possible and anticipate, and then let the system kind of work for you. And if you're going to say, hey, I got the airport in sight, well, now you're implying I want the visual really far out. But if you don't, the system will keep working you closer until the controller kind of turns the tables and says, hey, airport's 2:00. Do you have it in sight? Yes, I do. And now you're at a place where you're ready to descend in your normal pattern, right? Mm-hmm. So, you're talking to people like RH and myself. We're not intimidating. We're just people, and some of us fly both sides of the mic, some of us don't. But at the end of the day, it is a two-way street, and it's a conversation that needs to happen, because if it's just a one-way street, that's not how a system works, right? So if you can anticipate, and don't be afraid to ask questions. I don't understand. Guess what? Once you ask us, we get to use plain language now. That's the best part. We have to say it right the first time, but if you don't get it, we can say it however you want. Really turns the pressure off.
A commonly used tool. So we resort to plain language a lot with the pilots in our airspace, and it's perfectly normal.
Yeah.
But I'll kind of add to the being predictable. It's not really a puzzle in a lot of scenarios. An arrival and a departure and en route flying is, listen, be a part of the system, listen up for your call sign, but listen to what's happening to the traffic around you and start to form a picture. And it becomes far more predictable. And to, answer her concerns about the anxiety associated with talking to a controller, you can really minimize that a lot by thinking ahead.
Yeah. And if you're ever afraid of getting attitude back from a controller, don't let that scare you off of doing what you're supposed to do, because chances are if a controller's giving you attitude, everyone else at the facility knows that that's the controller that always gives attitude. And that does not represent the overwhelming vast majority of us. And most of us are very happy to go down to plain language and to describe things in the way that we might prefer to describe them anyway.
Bravo Golf, thank you. It's great having you. You're a valuable resource for our show. Look forward to doing another one, man.
Yeah, no, this is fun. I love doing this.
Kilo Lima, thank you for the great questions. It led to I think, a very good discussion. Hopefully you guys can learn from this. And if you have any follow-up questions, let us know. Take care, PG.
You too, man. See ya. Before we go, I want to know what you all think. For my CFIs out there, how do you teach your students? Do you like playing the role of ATC? Do you like it so much that you'll be applying to the open bid coming up, maybe? No, I'm kidding. Sort of. But I want to hear from you about your experience with this stuff in training, or maybe as you transition to bigger, faster, more powerful turbine aircraft. But I want to hear how it was for you. How did you learn air traffic? How did you get over mic fright? Is it the brain inhibit button for you when you push that button? Or is it really fun for you to talk on the radios? Let me know. Send me an email, brandon@podcastingonaplane.com, or better yet, record me a voice memo on your phone and you can email it that way, or just use the SpeakPipe widget that pops up every time you visit the website, Podcasting on a Plane. And while you're there, maybe consider supporting the show. If you find value in it, I'd really appreciate having you on board as a patron. You'll join the likes of Kilo Lima, who got this whole episode going with her email, and other greats like Captain Jeff, the airline pilot guy himself, RH and AG from Opposing Bases, Jamie of the Air Zoo, and more. And most importantly, before we go, I want to thank Kilo Lima for inviting RH and I to join forces for this one. We really had a blast, and we can't wait to do more. Make sure to check out today's show notes for links to plain English and more resources to up your ATC game. Well, that's all for now. Your frequency change is approved until next time, and report back on this frequency for the next episode. Good day.
I'm Chris Dunn from theflyingweatherman.com. The Podcasting on a Plane podcast is presented for entertainment purposes only. Brendan's comments and those of his guests, the website's content, and any of the social media, etc. are not part of his official responsibility as a controller or as an FAA employee. The views and opinions you hear on the podcast are his and those of his guests, and not necessarily that of the FAA. There is no nexus between Podcasting on a Plane and the FAA. Also, while he's a CFI, he's not acting as your CFI, nor is he your mechanic, your doctor, your shrink, or your spouse. This podcast is presented for entertainment, camaraderie, and fun, but is in no way, shape, or form professional advice or legal counsel. If you're in need of professional advice, get some from somewhere more appropriate than a podcast, no matter how good this one may be.
Mm-hmm.